What up, Pangburner peeps? My name is Michaela Miller, and today I'm going to be reviewing The Myth of Sisyphus by Albert Camus, otherwise known as Albert Camus. But he's French, I think, so it's pronounced fancy Albert Camus. Okay, so first thing is to define terms. He speaks a lot about Nietzsche, who, of course, is the main proprietor of nihilism. Nihilism being the notion that there is no inherent meaning in life. And so when Camus talks about the absurd, he's talking about what he perceives to be mankind's absurd desire to find meaning in the meaningless, like to find intrinsic meaning, that life should have intrinsic meaning. So when we say that someone's a nihilistic absurdist, essentially what we're saying is this person accepts the fact that life has no meaning, intrinsic meaning, and also seeks to find extrinsic meaning within the intrinsic meaningless. So life is meaningless, and that's okay, essentially, is what we're talking about here. And Camus, see, I say it, Camus will allude to the fact that it is in this searching for meaning that we find meaning. So the meaning is in the search. Because if there is no intrinsic meaning, all your search for it will never lead you to it. But the search itself is the thing which offers meaning to life. This book principally addresses the issue of suicide and how nihilism can lead one into suicide, and how absurdism can lead one out of just straight up terrible, life is completely pointless, so why should I live it type nihilism. So I'm going to start by I suppose I should start by describing what the myth of Sisyphus itself actually is. Camus takes quite a while to sort of explain it. He doesn't explain it until the very end, which seems like a structural, flaw? Why wouldn't you explain it in the beginning? It's the title of your book, dude. But, I don't know. I didn't write it, so if I did, I would have put the explanation of the myth of Sisyphus in the beginning. I would have opened with that, you'd think, right? But nonetheless, so Sisyphus essentially is, according to the Iliad, I believe, or the Odyssey, one of them. The Iliad or the Odyssey, don't cite me on that. Sisyphus was a man whose punishment in the underworld was to push a boulder up a hill, super heavy rock up a hill, in order he was given this task. You have to push the rock up the hill, but as soon as he got up to the top of the hill and he let it go, it would fall back down the hill again. So he's stuck in this endless cycle of absolutely meaningless physical exertion, and it's meant to be extreme punishment, which would be pretty easy. I mean, imagine that. Camus takes us through putting yourself in the shoes of Sisyphus. Imagine you're pushing this 500-pound rock up a hill, even if it's just a 30-foot hill, so 3 stories. You push it up a hill, you're stoked, it's finally at the top of the hill, you back away to just take a breath, fucking falls down again. And you have to, it's an endless loop forever. Imagine how shitty that would be. So, I'm now going to read from the final pages. This reading is a bit dense, so if I fuck it up a little bit, please just bear with me. Hopefully it's not too bad. You have already grasped that Sisyphus is the absurd hero. He is, as much through his passions and through his torture. His scorn of the gods, his hatred of death, his passion for life, won him that unspeakable penalty in which nothing is being exerted towards accomplishing, in which his whole being is being exerted towards accomplishing nothing. This is the price that must be paid for the passions of this earth. Nothing is told us about Sisyphus in the underworld. Myths are made for the imagination to breathe life into them. As for this myth, one sees merely the whole effort of the body straining to raise the huge stone, to roll it and push it up a slope 100 times over. One sees the face screwed up, the cheek tight against the stone, the shoulder bracing the clay-covered mass, the foot wedging it, the fresh start with outstretched arms, the wholly human security of 2 earth-clotted hands. At the very end of his long effort, measured by skyless space and time without depth, the purpose is achieved. Then Sisyphus watches the stone rush down in a few moments towards the lower world, whence he will have to push it up again towards the summit. He goes back down to the plain. It is during that return, that pause, that Sisyphus interests me. A face that toils so close to stones is already stone itself. I see that man going back down, with a heavy yet measured step, towards the torment of which he will never know the end. That hour, like a breathing space, which returns as surely as his suffering, that is the hour of consciousness. At each of those moments, when he leaves the heights and gradually sinks towards the layers of the gods, he is superior to his fate. He is stronger than his rock. If this myth is tragic, that is because its hero is conscious. Where would his torture be, indeed, if at every step the hope of succeeding upheld him? The workman of today trusts every day in his life at the same tasks, and this fate is no less absurd. But it is tragic only at the rare moments when it becomes conscious. Sisyphus, proletarian of the gods, powerless and rebellious, knows the whole extent of his wretched condition. It is what he thinks of during this descent. The lucidity that was to constitute his torture at the same time crowns his victory. There is no fate that cannot be surmounted by scorn. If the descent, is thus sometimes performed in sorrow, it can also take place in joy. This world is not too much. Again I fancy Sisyphus returning towards his rock, and the sorrow was in the beginning, when the images of the earth cling too tightly to memory, when the call of happiness becomes too insistent. It happens that melancholy rises in a man's heart. This is the rock's victory. This is the rock itself. The boundless grief is too heavy to bear. Those are our nights of Gethsemane, but crushing truths perish from being acknowledged. Thus, Sisyphus, at the outset, obeys fate without knowing it. But from the moment he knows, his tragedy begins. Yet at the same moment, blind and desperate, he realizes that the only bond linking him to the world is the cool hand of a girl. Then a tremendous remark rings out. Despite so many ordeals, my advanced age and the nobility of my soul make me conclude that all is well. Sophocles, Siphidius, like Dostoevsky's Kilbrelov, pardon my terrible pronunciation, thus gives a recipe for the absurd victory. Ancient wisdom confirms modern heroism. One does not discover the absurd without being tempted to write a manual of happiness. What? By such narrow ways? There is but one world, however. Happiness and the absurd are two sons of the same earth. They are inseparable. It would be a mistake to say that happiness necessarily springs from the absurd discovery. It happens as well that the feeling of absurd springs from happiness. I conclude that all is well, and that remark is sacred. It echoes in the wild and limited universe of man. It teaches that all is good, all has not been exhausted. It drives out of this world a God who has come into it with dissatisfaction and a preference for futile sufferings. It makes of fate a human matter, which must be settled among men. All Sisyphus' silent joy is contained therein. His fate belongs to him, his rock is his thing. Likewise, the absurd man, when he contemplates his torment, silences all the idols. In the universe suddenly restored to the silence, the myriad wandering little voices of the earth rise up, unconscious secret calls, invitations from all the faces. They are the necessary reverse and price of victory. There is no sun without shadow, and it is essential to know the night. The absurd man says yes, and his effort will henceforth be unceasing. If there is a personal fate, there is no higher destiny, or at least there is, but one which he concludes is inevitable and despicable. For the rest, he knows himself to be the master of his days. At that subtle moment, when man glances backwards over his life, Sisyphus returning to his rock, in that slight pivoting, he contemplates that series of unbalanced actions which become his fate, created by him, combined under his memory's eye, as soon sealed by his death. Thus, convinced of the wholly human origin of all that is human, a blind man, eager to see, who knows that the night has no end, he is still on the go, the rock is still rolling. I leave Sisyphus at the foot of the mountain. One always finds one's burden again. But Sisyphus teaches the higher fidelity that negates the gods and raises rocks. He too concludes that all is well. This universe, henceforth without a master, seems to him neither sterile nor futile. Each atom of the stone, each mineral flake of the night-filled mountain, in itself forms a world. The struggle itself towards the heights is enough to fill a man's heart. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. In summary, well, to summarize that point, Camus is asserting that in Sisyphus' realization of the futile nature of his struggle, he can find meaning, he can find enjoyment. And if Sisyphus can find meaning and enjoyment in such a terrible fate, then I think this is Camus' point. We can all find enjoyment and purpose and happiness in what we perceive to be the futile parts of our lives, like going to work every day at the same job, or if you're me, being disabled and keeping busy until you can go back to college. I think that's a really important thing to think about, because a lot of times we look at the futile parts of our lives as just sort of the throwaway bits. But if we can, in fact, engage in what Camus is talking about here, then even those parts of our lives that we wish that we would just skip if we could, we can find profundity and meaning even in those sort of dreary moments. So I'm going to read a bit more. This is how he opens the book. Absurdity and suicide. There is but one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide. Judging whether life is worth living or not amounts to answering the fundamental question of philosophy. All the rest, whether or not the world has 3 dimensions, whether the mind has 9 or 12 categories, comes afterwards. These are games. One must first answer. And if it is true, as Nietzsche claims, that a philosopher, to deserve our respect, must preach by example, you can appreciate the importance of that reply, for it will precede the definitive act. These are facts that the heart can feel, yet they call for careful study before they become clear to the intellect. He goes on to say that suicide has never been Sorry, that's my dog trying to get a fly. She's a funny girl. She'll get the fly too. She'll get it and she'll eat it, and I'm gonna laugh. So, Camus goes on to say, suicide has never been dealt with except as a social phenomenon. On the contrary, we are concerned here at the outset with the relationship between individual thought and suicide. An act like this is prepared within the silence of the heart, as a great work of art. The man is ignorant of it. One evening he pulls the trigger or jumps of an apartment building manager who had killed himself. I was told that he has lost his daughter 5 years before, and that he had changed greatly since, and that the experience had undermined him. A more exact word cannot be imagined. Beginning to think is beginning to be undermined. Society has but little connection with such beginnings. The worm is in a man's heart. That is where it must be sought. One must follow and understand this fatal game that leads from lucidity to the face of existence to flight from light. There are many causes for suicide, and generally the most obvious ones are not the most powerful. Rarely suicide is committed through reflection. So right off the bat, Camus is talking about how he's essentially, what he's going to allude to is how this realization of meaninglessness, or this acceptance of nihilism, can easily lead to one essentially rationalizing their way into suicide. And that's actually what first got me interested in this book, is because I just personally found myself in that spot, beginning to rationalize towards suicide. That is not a story for today, but sorry, my dog. She's great. I think that this issue of suicide and reasoning your way into despair isn't something that we talk about enough. I think that oftentimes when people hear about a suicide or about parasuicidal behavior or a suicide attempt, they think that they sort of automatically just assume that this person has gotten to that conclusion through strictly emotional means. But it is entirely possible for one to, through flawed reasoning, I'm going to put it in quotes, logic themselves into suicide, because it's a misapplication of skepticism. And that's essentially what Camus states over the course of this book. It's very dense. I had to read it like 4 or 5 times, and I still don't understand it all, but it's very, very profound, and it takes a look at, it addresses the issue of suicide in a way that I've never encountered in any other literature. It doesn't come at the reader with appeals to emotion or really anything other than, sure, accept that life is intrinsically meaningless, and create a dialectic where you can accept where you can accept this fact and also seek to find extrinsic meaning through the absurd. So I highly recommend. There's some other essays in here that I actually haven't read, but if you're interested in philosophy, if you're interested in nihilism or absurdism, or if you're interested in debunking nihilism or absurdism, I would recommend you read this. You can get it on Amazon. This has been The Myth of Sisyphus. I have been Michaela Miller, and I will see you next time.